Would you like to play some football?
Hey, welcome to Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast. I'm George Schroeder, joined by Todd Unzicker, and we are back after a couple weeks hiatus and ready to talk some college football and some faith with you. And a lot to talk about here as we sit here, kind of still early in August, but you can see kickoff finally coming. And part of the way we see it coming, Todd, is that the USA Today coaches poll, preseason poll, whatever anybody thinks about polls, is here. And so I don't care whether you think they should rank them or not rank them or when they should rank them or whatever. It's here. And so we talk about it every year. We can't help it. And so thoughts on the poll. Ohio State ranked number 1, Oregon number 2. So 2 Big Ten teams ranked number 1 and 2, followed by Georgia and Texas, a couple of SEC teams, and then Notre Dame. And then Indiana, our new powerhouse, right? So, and we could keep going through it, but thoughts on the coaches poll? I guess you could go macro or micro here, Todd.
Well, my first thought was, the Big Ten's dominance is even apparent during talking season. And, Ohio State and Oregon at the top of the list. I think that's a showdown. That's where I could almost flip those. Most of the coaches, they got 38 first place votes, but Oregon has that feel. Dan Lanning, they've been itching in closer and closer. And so, no qualms there. Georgia's kind of a constant, in that top 5. And certainly Texas is trying to take that step that Sark has been, promising. And maybe more than Sark is really the entire Manning effect that is going down there with Arch in this year. And I think a lot of us probably, us on the pod here, put a little too much pressure on him last year as a first-year starter, but certainly with the additions they've gotten in Cam Coleman and bolstering along the trenches, that rounds out. And then Notre Dame is a team that returns a lot and doesn't play a lot. I think they play the fewest ranked opponents, if memory serves, when I first saw this. But I think my surprise for me is Clemson at 23. Clemson at 23 with a new OC, although he's returning in Chad Morris, a 7-6 team ranked in the top 25. George, does that say more about Clemson and Dabo or more about the ACC?
I think it says more about the coaches or the media relations directors, as we used to joke, who vote in these polls. We always, that's a journalism joke, y'all, who are listeners. We joke that the coaches don't actually do the voting. Their media relations guys do. I do actually think coaches vote in most cases, but I think coaches are a lot like what the AP voters have been in the past. Sometimes they vote for the helmet, especially when you get that deep into the poll. And so I think there's some respect there for Dabo that maybe goes back several years, that maybe doesn't reflect how they've been over the last several years. And so I think that would be the surprise thing for me with that. But listen,
the other one is George is Tennessee. Yeah. Tennessee ranked at 18. They've only had 2 10-win seasons in the last 18 years. They're starting a new quarterback, possibly a highly touted freshman. That seems a little bit high to me. But the SEC's dominance in the poll is definitely noteworthy. While certainly you can't say they're the best conference, because for years the SEC,
you can because they will.
Well, that was always based on the number of national champions.
That's right. Well, and
for 3 years in a row, it's been the Big Ten. But certainly the SEC is the deepest, at least according to the coaches.
Yeah, and I think they are the deepest, which there's a topic we want to hit in a minute, that if they are the deepest, it's about to get harder in the SEC. The Big Ten doesn't just have the last 3 national title winners, all different programs. They're also 8-2 against the SEC in postseason play in that time. And sometimes you could sort of wash that away because it's a bowl game and who played and who didn't. But that includes some playoff games, and it's still a number that's out there. So the Big Ten, with Ohio State and Oregon there at the top, I don't think either one of us would be surprised if either of those teams were to win the whole thing. Let me talk about Texas for a second, because I do think that whether it was you and me or whoever, the Arch Manning hype was out of control last year. And so when he didn't reach that crazy level that was expected of him because of the hype, and I didn't think he would, it was his first year as a starter, then people thought he was a bust. And let me just tell you something, he was not a bust, even in the first half of the year. And in the second half of the year, he played pretty well. He got better and better as the year went on. I think Texas is loaded for bear. I think Texas is going to be really good. And there's tremendous respect for Georgia. That's why I think they're ranked third. It's not that much different in terms of the votes as far as that goes. But Texas might have been, if you ask me, I'd probably make Texas the favorite to win the SEC. And
I think
obviously,
they're going to be better, George, for sure. I like what they're the offensive line's been a little suspect. They bolstered that with some additions. And I just read today that there is a fifth-year player who went undrafted that is returning.
of course
And
he is.
yes, of course he is.
Yep.
So you got another guy, but I think they're going to be better. The question is, and we'll touch on this in another segment, but they play 7 ranked opponents, and if they are undefeated or only one loss, they're a very good team because they got Ohio State in week 2 right out of the chute, and so they're going to be playing the number 1 team in the nation before we get to mid-September, and they still then go on the road to Tennessee. They've got the Red River rivalry shootout, whatever we're allowed to call that nowadays. And then they've got Florida, Ole Miss right after that, back to back. And of course, they've got LSU and A&M. So, and Missouri coming in the coaches poll at number 25. That was another one that was a little confusing to me.
Yeah, look, I'm not all that high on Missouri. They're excited about Austin Simmons, the Ole Miss transfer. You remember he was the starter before he
A
got
year ago.
injured, and then he got Wally pipped and by Trinidad Chambliss, and people forgot all about him. So, but Lane Kiffin thought he was the guy, and Lane Kiffin knows quarterbacks, and so there's some light right there for Missouri. I just don't know what I think about that bunch of Tigers. I got to tell you, and it wouldn't be a dark horse at all because they're ranked number 2. You mentioned them. I think this might be the year for Dan Lanning and the Ducks to finally have a chance to really break through. They bring back Dante Moore as quarterback. They're losing an all-world tight end in Kenyon Sadiq, but they bring back some serious explosive playmakers out on the edge and wide receiver. And I think this could be the kind of year that Oregon fans have. They've always been trying to get to the top of the mountain and never quite gotten there. Been pretty close in a couple different eras, but this could be a great year for Duck fans. Wouldn't stun me at all. We're not ready to make those predictions yet. I'm just, as we look at this poll, it kind of spurs us to think about these things. It's still weird to me to see Indiana at 6. And I don't mean because they should be ranked 1. I mean because it's still weird for me that Indiana now has essentially the best season of all time, going 16-0 last year and being dominant. And the question that I have, and the question that everybody has, is, Fernando Mendoza is gone. Josh Hoover transfers in from TCU at quarterback. Is Kurt Signetti, has he built something that has serious staying power? And I know they've been to the playoff 2 years in a row, both of his 2 years as coach. But are we about to see Indiana at 6 and stop, and it not going to bother us other than we go, how could they be 6? They should be 3rd. Is that where we are now with Indiana?
I think staying power 100%. I'm a believer in Sig. I'm a believer in the program he's done. He's won everywhere he's gone. It shocks me that it took this long for him to get a job at a Power 4 school. And certainly he has proved the doubters wrong in the 2 years he's been in Indiana. I think what the question is, can they be what they were? And no, I think last year was the most miraculous, amazing season of any team in the history of college football. I said it last year as each week was going by. But, with these big conferences, George, that we have now, scheduling variance within a conference changes dramatically. You mentioned Oregon.
That's right.
And when we look at the Ducks and their schedule, there's no reason they shouldn't start off 3-0. And their first big test is on the road at Southern Cal, which I'm sorry, but I'm at a point where I'm Lincoln Riley and the Trojans are going to have to show me something before I get on that. But that's no pushover. That'll be a huge game in the Big Ten. But then, UCLA, Nebraska, that's another one. They haven't been good for 20 years. But the Ducks have Ohio State, a Michigan team that comes to Eugene, and their schedule's very favorable. But for the Hoosiers and Signetti, who've had a pretty favorable schedule the last 2 years, theirs gets exponentially harder this year, especially late in the year when Ohio State comes to town and they've got that Ohio State, Michigan, USC at Washington. That's going to be a sneaky game. I think the Huskies are going to put up a fight. Their schedule gets a lot tougher this year than it has been the last 2 years.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. In fact, it's one of the toughest P4 Power 4 schedules, I think, probably, that you can find. All right, so top 10 is Ohio State, Oregon, Georgia, Texas, Notre Dame at 5, Indiana at 6, Miami of Florida at 7, obviously. 8 is Texas A&M, 9 Oklahoma, 10 Ole Miss, 11 Alabama. I'm just including Alabama because it's so weird to see them not ranked in a preseason top 10. But out of that top 10 or 11, which of those would you chuck out of the top 10 or 11 right now? Is there one that you go, I don't know? And I'm not saying you have to pull somebody from the next 10 and move them up. I'm just saying, which one do you have is the most suspect to you?
The most suspect would probably be A&M.
Yeah.
They've lost quite a bit. They had a real great season going on until things got off the rails for them in that final game against Texas. I don't really have a problem with the top 10. I mean, Ole Miss, probably. Certainly that was a great story with Pete Golding, after Lane departed, and he really kept that train humming along. But you got to wonder, it's a different animal now. It's can Pete Golding live up to, being the coach of a top 10 team? That's an awful lot to put on a new coach. So I probably have him out there. Who would I put up in that? I'm pretty high on SMU and the Mustangs. When I look at the ACC, you've got Miami, and then you have to go all the way down to 17. And we're going to know a little bit about SMU when they go on the road to travel to Florida State and see, can Florida State pull off that week 1 upset like they did a year ago in upsetting the Crimson Tide. But I really like SMU's schedule. They got a tough game when they go at the middle of the month. They go to Louisville, and Jeff Brom has got a great squad with the Cardinal there. But, you look at Missouri State, Boston College, Virginia, Cal, Syracuse, all of those were bad teams. And in fact, when I look at SMU's schedule, they've got Notre Dame, I think, is the only ranked opponent that they play this season. And so who do I see as a top 10 team, just simply because of the schedule and the breakdown, is SMU. And I'm not going to sleep. My dark horse team this year is Virginia Tech and James Franklin. We're seeing that turnarounds can happen quick, and everybody points to what Franklin didn't do at Penn State, and that was he didn't win a national title. He didn't win the Big Ten. He went 0 for whatever in all of those top 5 matchups. But he also won every other game and averaged 10 wins a year. And people forget he won at Vanderbilt. And I think that the Hokies are starting to reinvest money in that. And we're starting to see, and I think in a wide open ACC, Virginia Tech is a sleeper in that conference.
No, I think that's a good pick. And of course, the place he left, Penn State, is going to be an interesting ride because Matt Campbell, I think very highly of his coach, but he's gone from the sort of the we try harder school of Iowa State to a place where Penn State, where they have expectations that are, inflated. Frankly, that's what got James Franklin at the end. But whether they're inflated or not, they're ultra high. I agree with you real quick on Texas A&M, and that's not a slight. Listen, I'm going to get in trouble with the folks who listen to this podcast who are local to me, like the congregation that I'm blessed to pastor. I love you guys. I know you're Aggies, and I love you. But that schedule last year was really, really, really light, and you took full advantage of it. And it's not the same this year. And I just find it's going to be a much more difficult road. Maybe the team will have improved. Maybe Marcel Reed will have some improvement. It'll take a bit of a leap. But that would be the most iffy for me. I'm intrigued by what Oklahoma could do if John Mateer stays healthy, because I believe they'll have a really good defense with Brent Venables. They do year in, year out. But the offense was terrible last year. Now, how much of that had to do with Mateer and the thumb, surgery and being out, and then the thumb, not necessarily being able to grip the ball or whatever? I don't know, but I don't think it was tremendous before he got hurt. So those would be the two that I really look at and go, I don't know, but I'm intrigued, and I think Oklahoma maybe has some potential upside. So the top 25 is fun. The AP top 25 will be coming out here pretty soon, and it'll be. People will argue about that too, and none of it matters till they start the games, which are the last weekend in August. And when they do, we're going to hear a lot more, and really up until then, we're going to hear a lot more about how tough the SEC schedule is. And we've always heard that, but now the reason is because they've gone to a 9-game schedule, a 9-game conference schedule, which is something that other leagues have been playing for years, but the SEC had not been playing, and now they are going to play a 9-game schedule, which means there's one more game. I mean, and so it literally means that half the league takes one more loss. How do you think that impacts the college football playoff race, Todd?
Well, statistically speaking, half the SEC teams are going to have one more loss.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah.
that's just going to happen. So the
Changes the rankings
records,
sometimes.
correct.
So,
And so that's going to change the rankings, which changes the formulas, which then naturally affects the what goes into the committee's minds in that, having covered the SEC, having watched it, it is top to bottom. Historically, there's some off years, but when you look at recruiting rankings, you look at players in the NFL, you talk to coaches who have bounced around from one conference to the next, they will tell you that the SEC is the deepest and the toughest to play in, and they just made it a lot harder. They made it more than 10% harder, statistically speaking. And so I think it's undoubtedly going to affect. I think we're going to see a lot more teams beat up on each other. When I look at the SEC, let's just take Georgia. They're the highest ranked, but Georgia's got some real question marks. Gunnar Stockton has not yet shown that he is a deep ball threat. The defense has not been up to form, while good has not been up to form that it was when they went on that 3-year run. And you look, Georgia's got games with Oklahoma, with at Alabama, a rejuvenated Auburn and Florida, on the road at Ole Miss, playing ranked Missouri. Who knows what a game in Columbia, South Carolina will be at the end of the season. Beamer is kind of on the hot seat, certainly brought in a lot of players. We'll see where they are at that point. But, you look at Georgia, and I don't think anybody is looking at them and saying that is a powerhouse. Georgia's got 4 games or 5 on its schedule that look beatable. Texas the same way. We've already touched on them. And then you've got you touched on it, from 8 to 11. You've got A&M, Oklahoma, Ole Miss, Alabama. Most of them play each other. And so
well, then
they're
LSU at 13. We haven't even touched on LSU. So, I mean,
right. We'll get to
yeah.
where we think with LSU, and then I think an overrated Tennessee is in there, and of course Missouri is lurking. And is there a team in the SEC? Can an Auburn and Golish, can the Gators get that back? One thing that Billy Napier left in Gainesville was he was taking a slow approach. He just didn't win enough games to stick around, and there was an infrastructure there that I think is pretty good that's going to allow the Gators to be much improved this year. But I think we're going to see a whole lot of 8-9 win teams in the SEC.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have a lot more arguments and probably more validity to the arguments about how a 3-loss team, a 9-3 team ought to be in the playoffs. And then one day they're going to start talking about 8-4 teams too. But I'm talking about in the current 12 team playoff configuration. But I think there'll be more validity potentially, not for all of the 9-3 teams, but you could dream up a scenario where a 9-3 team clearly ought to be in the playoff ahead of some 10-2 team somewhere else. I think that's possible here. Let me just say this, and this probably sounds dumb to say, but the 9-game conference schedule I don't think it hurts the Georgias and the Texases and those that are in the playoff hunt as much, the upper tier, upper division teams. I think that middle to and then the lower half of the SEC, that's where the 9-game conference schedule really is going to hurt, because seasons aren't going to look the same, because they're not going to be the same, because you're not going to have that extra non-conference cream puff, frankly, to get the W on. That's what's going to hurt. It's not going to hurt Georgia. It's not going to hurt Texas. I'm not saying they won't take a loss. I'm saying they're still going to be in playoff contention and that kind of thing. So here's one question I have for you that I was thinking about. I agree that historically, over the last quarter century at least, and maybe we go back further, the SEC has year in, year out been the deepest league, best league, deepest league, whatever, however you want to define it. With the current situation now where it's so much about the portal and it's less about high school recruiting, although that's still important, the edge was always in high school recruits, and then you would see it come out on the other end of the NFL draft choices, right? And we still see that. But is the SEC's edge in terms of how its depth is and all of that, is that diminished now with the new era with the portal, because recruiting, at least high school recruiting, doesn't mean as much? That's my hypothesis.
100%. And you look at the NIL and you look at the surging Big Ten, some of the largest alumni bases are Big Ten schools. Indiana,
It's
Michigan,
the richest
Ohio
conference.
State.
Yeah.
It's the richest dollar-wise. I heard somebody once say that you look at some of the CEOs of the Big Ten and they're at Oracle and NVIDIA, and the SEC has Golden Flake and Yellowwood. So, I think that, that's hyperbolic, and some of my SEC friends are going to get mad at me on that. But I think there's a point to that. That is the richest, is bigger markets. And I think you're seeing that's what it is. I mean, Coach Ed Orgeron simply said with the NIL era, he said, the only difference is that The SEC used to bring the money in the back door, and now they just bring it in the front door. And I
Yeah,
think
that's
that that
right.
has definitely leveled the playing field. Now
Leave
you
it to
add
Coach O.
9. I think the handwriting on the wall, if we were to talk here, and I hope we are in 5 years, and we see the SEC is not as dominant, I think that that's what we're going to be able to point to, is we're going to see that the NIL, the transfer portal, and that it kind of makes everybody more competitive. Now, one argument you can make is, well, good, that's good for the sport. There are more Indianas and there are more SMUs and more teams that can rise up. It makes it more competitive, more exciting games. The flip side of that is teams cannot build a dynasty the way you saw that. I think it was 11 of 12 national championships Georgia or Alabama were in. And, the
Mhm.
SEC was in almost all of those. So I just think those days are probably the parity is greater than ever before.
So I say two things. One, like Texas Tech and Indiana. Texas Tech on one extreme with a very invested billionaire. And I don't think Cody Campbell's the only billionaire who's invested, but a very invested billionaire who said, let's open up the floodgates of money and let's create a monster program. And, we'll see if they continue to succeed, but it got them to the playoff last year. Texas Tech is an example of the new world. But to go back to what you said about the Big Ten does have the most money now, and it has the biggest and most wealthy fan bases. So they should have the most resources. What I think could at least continue to even the playing field in terms of the NIL and portal era for the SEC is, yeah, they may have Yellowwood versus, Oracle or something like that, whatever it is in the Big Ten. But I think they still have the people who are more like the Cody Campbells of the world in terms of investment and passion. I don't mean they have billionaires. What I mean is they got more people who are willing to say, yeah, I've got disposable income and I'm going to give it to the quarterback. They got more of those guys in the SEC because they're more invested in passion. And I think that edge is something that at each school in the SEC is I'm sure scrambling to try to figure out, how do we monetize that passion? How do we get those guys who they're 20 millionaires and I'm a guy with $20 million. I don't have 200 million or 2 billion, but how do I get that guy to continue to give? And that's what they've got to figure out. And they've got to spread it out and get 25 of those guys invested year after year after year instead of 2 guys. So, all right, well, it's going to
Another
be,
team,
yeah,
another
go ahead.
team on that. Another when we were talking about Texas Tech, and I was glad that you mentioned them because I know you being in Texas, that's certainly a hot topic. But you've got 3 teams in the Big 12. Big 12 the last several years has been a wide open conference. Most notably when Arizona State was picked dead last and
Right.
came all the way up and ended up in that. But you've only got 3 teams, BYU, Texas Tech, and Houston in the Big 12 in the preseason coaches rankings. Guess what? BYU doesn't play either one of those teams. And when you
Mm-hmm.
look at BYU, their toughest game is, as we sit here today, they do play Notre Dame, but it's at home. And they also play, big rivalry game at Utah, but Utah breaking in a new coach. And we'll see what happens there. And they really, showed the door to a coach who did nothing but win there. And so I think you could see a BYU late in the season being in that top 10 simply because of these big schedules, and the schedule draw is very favorable to BYU.
Yeah, you missed that big Saturday, November 14th matchup that BYU has at home against the mighty Bears of Baylor. Sookum. This is a shout out to my son, and that's a shout out. So
Well, the Bears
uh,
got a big game week 1 against Auburn, and that's kind of
in
going to be an
Atlanta. Yep.
interesting test there for Golish and
Well,
the Auburn Tigers.
and we're not going to talk about at Baylor, obviously, but just side note, former Florida quarterback DJ Lagway, whose dad played at Baylor, is transferred to Baylor, and we'll see if
That's
he
right.
can inject some life into the Bears. They had a good offense last year. That's a different story. So, yeah, this is not a Baylor podcast because we're going to refer to playoff potential. And so until further notice, that's the last Baylor reference.
And
I
we're
think that's
breaking down the coaches poll for 27 minutes, and we have yet to mention the Lane train.
because they're ranked 13th, which is probably about right for right now, I think. But they went on a spending spree, not just getting Lane. Obviously, much controversy when he left Ole Miss before the playoff, in the middle of a run to the playoff. And he's created a situation where part of this federal legislation that is, at least trying to be passed has a Lane Kiffin rule where you can't do that anymore. But they spent a ton of money on Lane, but then they spent a ton of money on a bunch of players in the portal. And the expectations are, no, this does not say anything. They're always sky high at LSU, but they're sky high at LSU. So is that legit? Should they be sky high for 2026 or not? I think they'll be a whole lot better than they were, but I don't know if I'm ready to say Lane's taking them to the playoff in year one. That's kind of where I am. I'm not ready to make a bold prediction, but that's kind of where I am. What do you think?
I, I think he can take him to the playoffs. We're going to know a lot more. I think he could lose to Clemson and still make the playoffs if he gets it going. But if anything we can see, there's no building anymore in college football. Signetti, if you could do that at Indiana, you could certainly. Lane Kiffin, as controversial as his exits are, he is a good coach and had
Yep,
Ole
he is.
Miss, Ole Miss, who's no powerhouse or hasn't been since the 1950s. But he's got a tough road ahead. That Clemson game, we don't know what we're going to get with the Tigers. The coaches think they're a top 25 team. I'm not ready to write Dabo off yet. I don't think that's an easy game for your first game in a new environment. But he goes to that mega showdown on the 19th of September, goes to Oxford, and I kind of look at that next week right after that, hosting the Aggies and just the difficulty there. Of course, Alabama and Texas, and then a road game at Tennessee. It's not an easy schedule, and I think Lane could sneak in there, but I'm not betting your money, George, on that.
No, and please don't. I spent what little money we had in Europe the last couple of weeks when we went on our trip, so I don't actually have any, even if I was going to do that. But I tried to keep up with what was going on in college football, and thankfully there wasn't a ton. But hey, look, that game September 19th, and we talked about that on the podcast we did a couple of weeks ago. That's the game that we're all going to watch. I'm going to go out on a limb right here, right now, and say that LSU is going to win that game in Oxford, because that is exactly the kind of environment that Lane is going to thrive in. It's a little bit like when he took Ole Miss to Tennessee and they, threw things at him, right? They didn't have anything against Ole Miss. It was all against Lane. Well, Mississippi already hates LSU, right? They consider that a big rivalry. And just the way this thing went. And by the way, when he went back to Tennessee, it had been years and years and years since he left Tennessee. This is, 9 months after he left Mississippi at the wrong time. But I think Lane's going in there on September 19th and winning that game. And then you're right. What happens the week after that with A&M in Baton Rouge? I don't know. What happens thereafter with the rest of that schedule? I don't know. But I think he's going to win that game, because I think that is the game that makes Lane Kiffin tick, is being the villain in that kind of game. And he'll have his team ready to go. And if they're as talented and as good as they look like they are on paper, I'd make them the favorite anyway. And that's no slight to an Ole Miss team that returns a lot of guys, including Trinidad Chambliss, from a playoff team. It's just, I think that sits there and sets up for Lane Kiffin, even though it's going to be in what'll be a snake pit at Oxford that night.
And let's be honest, Sam Leavitt leaving Arizona State and coming to Baton Rouge. If Sam Leavitt is having an amazing season, Lane Kiffin and the LSU Tigers are going to the playoffs. The transfer, they bolstered, the most expensive transfer portal class, the number one transfer portal class, highlighted by that offensive lineman, Jordan. Where were my notes here? From Colorado, Jordan Seaton, who was absolutely incredible, leaves Dion and the Buffaloes and comes down to Baton Rouge. If those two are really clicking, then this is a playoff bound team. I don't think it's a lot. LSU is not even Indiana, and Lane Kiffin is a proven coach. And so the more we talk about this, the more I think, and listen, I know you just spent a bunch of money in Europe, but you've got time to save up. Single tickets for that game at Vaughn Hemingway Stadium, they're only $605 for a single game ticket. So George, you've got time to make the drive over to beautiful Oxford, Mississippi, and hit the Grove.
Well, I'll meet you there. And I'll tell you what, Dale, if you'll buy the 2 tickets, I'll get our dinner and the hotel room.
Okay.
But the hotel room is going to be in Memphis, so the price will be a little less.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, man, 600. My goodness. I don't think so. I am looking forward to attending a couple of games this year. A buddy of mine is a big Duck fan, and so they're going to play at Oklahoma State on September 12th, I think is the date. So I'm going to drive up from where we live and and meet up with him. We're going to go to the game in Stillwater together. I'm interested to see, frankly, Oregon, but also what Eric Morris does at Oklahoma State is moving from North Texas and bringing basically his entire team with him. I know they'll be better than they were last year. So, all right. So before we move on, one thing that's sort of off the radar, but's really cool. All right. And it's essentially it's the off-season version of MACtion, Mid-America Conference.
Oh, yeah.
Akron, the Zips, have an offensive coordinator of the game promotion. And maybe you guys have heard about this, but the idea is you pay a little bit of money, get into a raffle, and you're supposed to do it. It's season ticket holders who are eligible. And one lucky winner gets the opportunity to work with Joe Moorhead, the head coach, and help script. Apparently, you get to design, not necessarily design, but choose a play or two for the opening drive of Akron's home opener, not their season opener, but their home opener against Robert Morris on September 12th. And that is a genius idea.
It's fantastic.
I'd be scared to death if I was a coach, but it's a genius idea. No. So here's my first question before we get into this actual specifics. If you had the opportunity to do that, what play would you tell them they have to call on second down or something?
Well, that is what I do on Saturdays is I call plays.
Yes.
So
I know you're
it's going to be
coach,
what did I do on first down? But the Akron Zips, I think I'm going to call a rollout with some sort of levels concept and have the receiver look far the quarterback look far and hope. And if that corner goes back or the safety comes over, hit the second level. And if both of those are coupled up, then we're gonna dump it off to a tight end coming out on a one route.
You're bringing an actual football knowledge.
Yeah.
Think like Joe Fan who wins the raffle. Here's what I'm thinking. 4 verts. Just
of course.
Chunk it.
Of course.
That's what I'm thinking.
No fan is going to call inside zone on their first play.
All season ticket holders are entered into the drawing, right? And so people are buying season tickets as a result. What the cool thing is, there's stories coming out now that Robert Morris fans have been buying season tickets to Akron games in hopes of winning to kind of mess up the situation, so to speak. Try to blow up the opening drive. Yeah. So
there's going to be NCAA investigations into the Akron Zips Robert Morris game because of all of this.
So the reports are Akron sold out its suite inventory for the first time in program history following the announcement, and they surged past their annual ticket sales goals with several weeks to go. And so good for them. Great idea. I mean, great idea. I love it. And I'm not going to buy any Akron season tickets because I don't think I'll use any, but maybe some of our listeners will. If you do, please report back. That's a genius idea. And if you need to sell tickets, what a good idea. Now that doesn't actually put people in the seats, but maybe it will. Who knows? So, all right, there's a lot of things we could talk about, but we've got a couple more things that we're going to do here before the season begins. We've got at least 2 more podcasts before the first kickoff. And so I'm excited about that. And I actually think, Todd, unless you think we should hit one more thing, we ought to go ahead and move to our faith segment. And we'll just do that.
Let's do it. We got so much more coming up. We need our listeners coming back. And we're going to have a lot of news coming out. Fall camps got underway here this week. And so we've got to preview the season coming up. We got to talk about impact players, maybe even have a guest or 2 on. And so we got a lot to cover. So let's dive in and hear what God's been speaking in and through you, George.
Yeah, let's do that. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and roll right into the faith segment right now. So this morning, I was able to teach, and we're recording this on a Sunday evening, so I was able to teach from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, and the first 11 verses. And it's an episode in Jesus' life during his earthly ministry. He's teaching. I'll give you the context here. He's teaching, and he's got a big crowd pressing in on him. It was early in his ministry, but the crowds were starting to show up, and it said the crowd was pressing in on Jesus, verse 1 of chapter 5, to hear God's word. And he's standing by a lake. And so he saw 2 boats at the edge of the lake. The fishermen had left the boats and they were nearby and they were cleaning their nets, washing their nets after a night of fishing. And so he gets into one of the boats, which belonged to Simon Peter, who is going to become a disciple here in a minute. And And so he asked Simon to put out a little bit from the land. And so what he did was he got a little distance from the crowd and was able to sort of utilize that as sort of a natural amphitheater, and it probably enhanced the speaking voice, but it really helped him be able to teach in that situation. We don't know what he taught. The point of this actual story from Jesus' life is this. Verse 4, when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, who's in the boat with him, put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch. And so Simon says, Master, we've worked hard all night long and caught nothing. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets. When they did this, they caught a great number of fish, and their nets began to tear, and they had to signal to the other boat to come help them. And they caught so many fish that both boats began to sink. And I'll get a little bit deeper into that in a second. But I want you to sit there for just a second and understand Jesus was a teacher. That's what they knew him as at the time. He was a carpenter by trade. And I want you to put yourself in Simon's shoes, or Simon Peter's shoes, when he hears Jesus said, now go to the deep water and put the nets out. And he says, wait a second, man, we fished all night long and we didn't catch anything, but if you say so. So Simon Peter is a professional fisherman. It's what he does. It's his career. And he's got this guy telling him, hey, here's what you ought to do. It's a little bit like if we told Joe Moorhead, here's how you ought to call every single play in the game, which of course we do, right? Because we're fans, but
Right.
we're wrong about it. But that's what Joe Moorhead would be like. Would you stop? I've got this. That's how Peter felt. And you can understand that. But humoring Jesus, he went and he did it. And they had this gigantic catch. And it says in verse 8, when Simon Peter saw the catch, and it was so big that both boats began to sink, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, go away from me, because I am a sinful man, Lord. For he and all those with him were amazed at the catch of fish they had taken. And then it says, don't be afraid, Jesus told Simon. From now on, you'll be catching people. And then they brought the boats to land, left everything, and followed him, Jesus. And so there's a lot going on there, right? But there's a couple things. One, has God ever told you to do something and you think you know, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense?
Mm.
And you're like, essentially you're saying, I know better than you, God. I've got this. And so grudgingly, Peter does it. And the results are unbelievable, amazing. He's amazed, he's astonished, he's in awe. And there's a note of fear in that awe, because he just gets a glimpse of who Jesus really is. He sees the power of who Jesus is. And I don't think at that moment he knew this is the God-man. He didn't know that fully yet. But it was like, oh my goodness, this is different. And so he calls him Lord in that moment, which is different than calling him Master when he said, Master, we fished all night, right? And we didn't catch anything. He was saying teacher, slightly elevated type of guy. Now he's saying Lord. And again, I don't think it meant that he understood fully at that point who Jesus was, who he is, but he knew something was going on there. And I'm just going to say, if you catch a glimpse of God, you're going to go away from me, because I'm a sinful man, Lord. You're going to get a recognition of who you are. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that he saw that. And so,
reminiscent of Isaiah.
Yep.
When Isaiah saw
In
the
Isaiah
glory of
6.
the Lord, and
That's
when
right.
he sees this miraculous thing that clearly Jesus did, he has awe. And I think, I love this passage, George. I'm going to go back and listen to your sermon from this morning, because I see for our listeners, if you're listening to this, we know you love college football, but you're at least curious, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And maybe you're a seeker and you're listening to this. Number one, you've got to have an awe of God to realize he's not the man upstairs. He is the great I am, the one that was and is, and God became man. That's why we celebrate Jesus, is that he was fully God and fully man. And certainly Peter had that awe of Jesus in this moment. But also we see another mark of what it means to be a follower is you're going to be an evangelist. Verse 10.
Right.
Jesus
That's right.
says, from now on, you're going to be catching people and you're going to be an evangelist. And when you're in awe of something, you and I talked about covering the Rose Bowl a couple episodes ago. And man, I can't help but tell people about that experience. It was probably the greatest Rose Bowl game ever. But just even before that, the pregame, the pageantry, I couldn't help but tell people, when you're in awe of who Jesus is, what he has done in your own life, you can't help but tell others. And so we see that as a mark, is that commitment to go and tell, whether it's what you were doing in Europe, or maybe it's across the street, maybe our listeners, the groups of guys and friends they get together and they talk college football with. be that fisherman that
That's right.
Jesus is calling these. And the last thing I see here is verse 11. You just told it. They brought their boats to land, left everything, and they followed him.
That's right.
Being a Christ follower is total surrender.
That's right.
And I would have bet that some of our listeners right now, God's been calling them to do something. And I think this is a great passage here in Luke 5 that George, you just did a great job of kind of walking us through that, when you follow Jesus, it's total surrenders. It's not the Jesus, the Burger King, have it your way, Jesus. It is the
Well,
total surrender. And that's what we see in this calling of Peter and the first disciple.
well, that's right. And I appreciate you fleshing that out too. It wasn't this is the fullest, the most fleshed out account of Christ's call, Jesus's call of Peter to be a disciple of his, a follower of his. In other accounts, like in Mark, it says immediately Peter left his nets and followed Jesus. It's pretty clear, it's implicit in verse 11 that they brought the boats to land, left everything and followed him. I want you to think about the situation. They just had the biggest catch they ever had. The best day of their career when he thought he wasn't going to get anything, and the night before he got nothing. And they don't sell the fish, they don't clean the fish, they don't eat the fish, they leave the fish and they go with Jesus, which tells you who's worthwhile, what is worthwhile to follow, right? So it wasn't about the great catch, it wasn't about that. It was about seeing who Jesus is, who they are, and then hearing his call to them. And it was like, oh yeah, I'm immediately following you with everything I have and everything I am. And I just love that. And so my question is, maybe some of our listeners, you've never actually turned and repented from your sin and followed Jesus. You need to do that. You need to do that. He died to pay the penalty for your sin, and he rose again, conquering death. And if you will just turn from sin and follow him, you'll be saved and you become his follower and you're in Christ. You need to do that now. Don't wait. Reach out to one of us at Todd Unzicker on Twitter, at George Schroeder on Twitter. Email us at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com. Reach out to us. We want to talk with you. We'll end up on the phone with you. If you're nearby, we'll end up, maybe we can have coffee. Todd's in North Carolina. I'm in Texas. You guys know that in Texas, we drive 2 hours and call it lunch, right? So we can do that. I would love to do that. But Christ followers, what is God telling you to do that maybe you're like, man, that doesn't make sense. I don't understand why you would call me to do that. What in the world are you doing? I got this. What is it that you need to do to follow Jesus? And I would just encourage you and challenge you, follow him. Obey what it is he's telling you. Obey what it is he's telling you. It's worthwhile. He's worth everything, giving up everything, leaving everything and following him. That's what I would say to you guys today. And I hope that God will work in your hearts the way he worked in my heart as I was working through and studying this passage. And that's my hope for y'all today. So
Amen.
we used to have a segment, Todd. We called it On My Heart. And I guess that's not what that is, but that's on my heart today. And so that's where I am. So,
and that's the heart
hey,
of every Christ follower. We see this here.
That's right. So, hey, we're gonna be back, and we're not hitting our weekly schedule yet, but we're closing in on it. We're getting much closer. So we'll be back in a couple of weeks, and then it's going to start being rapid fire Gridiron and the Gospel episodes. We'll be joined by Dean and Sarah and others, and we do have a couple of really good guests. We're not going to drop them right here in front of you just yet, but a couple really good guests lined up, and we'll have other guests too. But we're going to keep talking football and then our shared faith in Jesus Christ pretty quickly here on a weekly basis. So visit us online at gridironandthegospel.com. Find us on Twitter or Instagram at gridiron_gospel. I already said reach out on Twitter at George Schroeder, at Todd Unzicker. Email us at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe in your favorite podcast app. That really helps if you'll do that. Tell friends about us. You can find us on YouTube if you haven't already. Here we are, and you can watch the podcast if you want. And listen, stay tuned for the next edition of Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast.